Welcome to the Patrick Coffin Show once again, a beacon of light in a world of spam. I'm going to keep saying that until it becomes funny. We're in Los Angeles, the media capital of the world, with Dr. Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, clinical psychologist, and the king of red pill dispensing to at least 2 generations now. His new book is called 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos, which hit #1 on Amazon in the US, Canada, and the UK. Jordan, welcome back.
Good to see you. You were one of my early adopters. You were on episode 4 of the Patrick Coffin Show. Back when I first heard about you, it would have been the fall of 2016, and I saw a headline on cbc.ca. Professor says, quote, "I am not a bigot." And that's, I realized that's someone I want to talk to. Anybody the CBC calls a bigot is probably someone I want to connect with. And then I read the story about Bill C-16 and the forced speech.
Yeah, well, you were one of the first people I talked to about that.
Right. Well, doesn't it feel like 10 years ago?
It's been quite the trip. Yes, that's for sure.
Your book just blew up. 12 Rules of Life, an Antidote to Chaos. #1 on Amazon, Canada, US, and the UK.
Australia too.
Australia too.
I don't think it hit Amazon. I think it hit #1 briefly in the UK, but it's been hovering around #2. But that's okay. I think there's a cookbook that's stomping me in the UK.
So what you're saying is Hitler is your god.
Yes, that's precisely.
Ha! Gotcha.
Yeah, no,
couldn't resist.
Yeah.
Can we start with the Kathy Newman interview just briefly? I know it's been flogged to death, as all good dead horses should be. I am always interested in secondary phenomena. So, for instance, let's take militant Islam, Islamofascism. People in the media are more interested in the people who note acts of terrorism than the acts of terrorism. So you have the ritual shaming of people like Douglas Murray, who I know has written about your work.
I met
Robert
him
Spencer.
in the UK.
You did? Okay.
Yeah, that was very interesting.
The commentators who are pointing out the problem are attacked, as though somehow there's sort of a strange derangement syndrome where the people who are noting the facts are set apart for opprobrium and criticism, but the actors themselves, the primary phenomena, are kind of ignored. I think you fit in there because you're pointing out a problem with neo-Marxism and the postmodern presupposition that runs so much of academia. You're just saying, look over here. Do you see what I see? And then you come in for, warnings.
I'm saying a bit more than that. I'm saying, look, over here, this is happening, and it's indisputable. But I'm also saying it's really bad, and something should be done about it. And so some of that opprobrium?
I think so.
I suppose has been deserved, given that the people who I'm pointing at are trying to defend themselves. But most of it's a consequence of exactly the processes that you described, which is to shoot the messenger.
Right. Yeah, that's a pithy way of putting it. And
well,
then,
it's not surprising, because if someone's pointing to a real problem, it's perfectly reasonable for the person who's being informed about that problem to say, look, I'm going to start by assuming that you're just mad, like crazy.
Yeah.
Because maybe there's a real problem, but that's really bad. It'd be a lot easier if there was just something wrong with you. And so I'm really going to check that possibility out first, thoroughly, before I'm going to painfully turn my attention to what would be a much more intractable issue.
Right. So, it's more charitable to assume insanity than evil or willful, sort of malicious, ignoring the facts.
Definitely. Well, and I think that's a lot of what happened to me in Canada, really, is that I stood up and said, look, in our peaceful little country, there are some appalling things going on legislatively behind the scenes, and here are the consequences, and they're driven by this pernicious ideology, and here's its nature. And the logical response from people was, well, wait a second, you're talking about Canada. Things like that don't happen here. There must be something wrong with you. And so you're a bigot, you're a transphobe, you're a racist, you're an alarmist, you're an evil capitalist, it doesn't matter.
White male.
That too. Well, in fact, that's what happened with the Globe and Mail today. That's what they called me, was an angry white male, which I thought was true or not, let's say, to headline that in our national newspaper, let's say, is absolutely appalling. To use that racial epithet, to let that define the terms of the debate, is a precise indication of exactly what's wrong with the people who play identity politics. It's absolutely sickening.
You could say, hey, I'm not white. I'm part native.
Right, right,
Dear,
right.
Letter to the editor.
Right. I think I am 3% sub-Saharan African, as it turns out.
I
think
actually
right.
called that upon meeting
You did, you
yeah.
did. Yeah, I had my DNA tested, so.
I'm dying to do that. Yeah, I'm Patrick Coffin. So Coffin comes from a Hebrew word kufen, which means basket. And as a basket case, it just sort of fits.
Oh, I see. Perfect.
Later on, in a few minutes, I want to get into, it's a concept the Romans had called nomen est omen. Names are destiny. And I've been pondering your name, so we'll put your name on the couch in just a few minutes. But I think Kathy Newman, doing her job as an aggressive journalist on Channel 4, succumbed to this not listening mode. I've watched it twice, and she had one talking point after another. And earlier I was joking, so what you're saying is,
yes.
You've
Many
probably seen
people
the
are
many,
making that
there's
joke.
some really hilarious memes where it's all edited, and it's just one montage of her saying it again and again,
Right, yeah.
with your reacting to it and so on. After she ran out of talking points, and you were able to say, well, you've been making me uncomfortable with no problem. And by the way, more power to you, when the mask dropped, that seemed to be
That
a
was the
moment where
stellar
real
moment.
conversation could begin.
Yes.
She was open to it because she had
Yes.
nothing. You kind of took away the mask and the talking
Yeah, well,
points.
one of my friends who was with me in and had reviewed that in the immediate aftermath, reviewed the video, he said, I'm not sure that the joke you made at that point, because I said, gotcha,
Yeah.
and I was doing my best to be humorous, and not to be mean, but there was still a zing in it because of
It
course
was
humor is
wry.
like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
but it was a kind of a humorous thing.
Yeah,
too.
yeah. So, and I don't feel that was necessarily a mistake. But his comment was, look, you could have used that as an opportunity to engage her at that moment in a genuine conversation. And I thought about that, and he made a valid point. But it certainly was the occurrence during the conversation where the mask fell, and we were actually two people sitting in a room instead of her grilling her imaginary opponent, which was what the rest of the interview was. She was interviewing the figment of her imagination and not noticing, even for a moment, that it bore no resemblance to me.
Right. She used a flamethrower on a straw man. He burned up really quickly.
Yeah. Well, and it would have been even okay, I think, if she would have started that way and thrown, and been that sort of professional hostile, which I think is actually not a great way of handling an interview to begin with. But whatever, be that as it may.
It's gotcha 101. It's funny that you say gotcha. That's her
Right.
whole
Well,
shtick
that's
was
why I
gotcha.
said it. That's why I said it. It's precisely. That's all she was doing, was trying to set me up to fall on my face. And fair enough, sort of. If you're a journalist, you have to dig, but you should dig with questions that you actually have. There was nothing about what she asked me that she was genuinely curious about. That's the thing that was so bothersome. It was like, you don't even believe what you're saying. It's either a professional front, or it's an ideological front, or it's a career move, or this is how you've been trained, or you haven't thought it through, or you didn't do your homework, or this is your habitual way of interacting with people that you think you dislike, or something. But it was never, well, look, I'm really concerned about the pay gap, and here's what I think it means, and this is why it makes women suffer, and why do you think that's okay? That's a real question, right? But that wasn't it. It was more like, well, you don't believe the pay gap exists, so you must be some sort of fascist monster. It's well, no, sorry, that's a non-starter.
And here's why.
Yeah, and here's why,
Now, after the mask dropped, I noticed something different about her body language changed. I'm not a body language expert by any stretch, but I noticed little tells, maybe because I'm a magician. I noticed people's tells, rather to kind of a minute detail.
Right.
And my theory is that she started to fall for you at the time. I don't mean romantically you, but as I was watching this, I thought her thought bubble is, where has someone like this been all my life? Because you contended with her and you modeled your own method in a way. You were patient, you were a little bit irritated, but you didn't walk off the set, you didn't do a mic drop, you didn't go for a triumphalistic, kind of revenge.
Right.
And so back to the secondary thing, right? So the primary thing is your conversation with her on Channel 4. The secondary thing is all the crapola that got stirred up, all the salads, the
that
side
was
issues,
really something.
the side circus. So, she had to have security. I
Yeah, well,
thought
that was the Guardian piece. That
right,
was because the Guardian started that. That was
follow-up.
so interesting. I read that carefully, and so the headline was something like, security called in for Kathy Newman after Channel 4 interview.
Alt-right threats,
like that. Yeah,
etc.
alt-right threats. Okay,
Yeah.
and so that was the headline. And so I thought, okay, that's what it's about. And then the opening 4 lines were all ad hominem attacks on my character. And I thought, oh, I see. So that's what the headline should have been. And then the claim was that security experts had to be called in to evaluate the threat and that the police were contacted. And I thought, well, you can call in security experts to evaluate any threat. And the fact that the police were called doesn't mean that you have any evidence of any sort.
Correct.
I thought, oh, I see. So now we're doing victim narrative, victim 101. And so, which I thought was absolutely appalling, because whatever Kathy Newman is, she is not a victim. She's a powerful person. And she's certainly part of the patriarchy rather than part of what it's trampling.
Yeah.
Let's be very clear about that.
Irony.
And then what happened was that, well, then I thought, okay, you know, maybe people are harassing her. I'll go on Twitter and say, look, we were exchanging words like, back off if you're making threats.
Yeah, please stop.
Clue in, man, and quit, you know, because really, and so I tweeted that, but then what happened was that the fact that I tweeted that was used as evidence that the threats were real. And
Exactly,
I thought,
you
God,
cannot
why?
win.
Yeah.
And then the third,
Yeah.
let's say, so primary, secondary, the third thing is that you said, in another interview, I think with the Dutch guy, the Indian guy, that was a very good
he
exchange.
did a good job, yeah.
When you expressed interest in having like an hour or a longer form conversation with her, I thought, he can't win. That's going to be interpreted as, oh, Jordan Peterson wants to rub her face in it for a whole hour this time.
Right.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and you know, then what happened after the Guardian wrote is that like 15 newspapers in the UK jumped on that story and replicated, and then like 5 newspapers in Canada. And I thought, oh my God, really? This is what's happening? It's like, we had this interview. It didn't go well for Kathy for reasons that were clear to virtually everyone who watched it, by about 100-to-1 ratio.
Yeah.
There's no blaming that on trolls. There's just not 5 million trolls on YouTube. It's like you just don't get to play that game.
Yeah.
The threats weren't real. And yet here comes the victim narrative, and it's just overwhelming. And I thought, wow, that's so amazing. And I contributed to it by asking people to regulate their behavior intelligently. And so I was just shaking my head about that. But then it flipped again, because then a number of other journalists came out and said, no, you don't get to play the victim card in this situation. And that's just not what happened. And the threats were not credible. And that's a cover story. And mostly that narrative carried the day, I would say, in the so-called mainstream press, although not entirely. You know, I mean, the Globe and Mail today, Canada's so-called national newspaper, wrote an article where, again, they repeated the allegations that, you know, my army of trolls had abused and tormented poor Kathy Newman, which is just, well, it's such willful misrepresentation of the situation that it's quite mind-boggling. But to me, it also announces the death knell of the mainstream media. It's like, you just can't do that. People will just stop reading, and that is what they're doing. It's like they stopped watching the Grammys. I think they fell 25%, right? It's like,
big time.
We don't want to be lectured on our political beliefs by actors. Well, why would you want that? You know, so
Sometime, I want to get to the book. So 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. A more masculine title is hard to craft. Rules. There are 12 of them. It's straightforward, and it's an antidote to something. Chaos. I think you have tapped into a lot of young masculine chaos with a kind of, it's like an elixir. You've got this tonic you're giving them that taps into their own desire for order, and you're laying out a template
maturity
and for maturity.
Even. Yeah, I would say for maturity and purpose. You know, rather than order per se, like the order would be associated with the discipline necessary to pursue that purpose and attain the goals. But it's not a call to order per se. So it's a call to the process by which order is generated out of chaos. That's more precisely the case. And it's based on 2 principles. One is, this is something I firmly believe, is that, there's plenty of darkness in the world. And to the degree that people don't illuminate that darkness with their ability, then the darkness is greater than it could be. And so that's basically what I've been trying to, describe and explain in my lectures. It's like, I believe this. You have the capacity. I believe that people are making a choice between tilting the world towards heaven and tilting the world towards hell with every decision they make, with every word they utter, and that the consequences are actually of import. And it doesn't matter who you are.
Small is huge.
Yeah, small is what you have, first of all, and it's not as small as it looks. So it's not anywhere near as small as it looks, in fact. So you have plenty in front of you to contend with, plenty of potential, and it actually is important that you contend with it. Not just for you, although it's important for you because it gives your life dignity and purpose and meaning and stops you from being bitter and resentful and hateful and murderous and genocidal and all of those terrible things that go along with resentment.
Yeah.
It's that, but it also has your life properly conducted, has a genuinely wide-ranging beneficial effect on everything around you. So, and I believe that to be nothing more than the literal truth. Well, nothing more. It is more, because it's also the metaphorical truth. But I believe you can just lay that out as a statement of fact. It's like the world is a lesser place without you fully committing yourself to its improvement. And I think people know that. So once it's articulated, and the people come up to me, and it's more and more women all the time, and older people now too. The demographic is starting to switch, but people come up to me all the time and they say, look, I already knew the things that you were saying. I knew them deep in my heart, let's say, because they're archetypal truths. But having them articulated really helped me move forward with them. It's like,
and you're inspiring people to not be afraid to speak the truth in their context. I think that's part of the reason why.
I'm also inspiring them to be afraid of not speaking the truth in their context, right? Because, it's very frequently the case, and this is why I decided to make my original videos decrying Bill C-16 and the compelled speech legislation in Canada. It's like, it isn't like speaking up is without risk, and the risk is immediate and tangible. But not speaking up, man, you want to do something risky, that's risky. It's just that it kills you. You take a little bit of arsenic every day and die of the cumulative poison in 30 years while you suffer the entire time. It's like, that's just not an improvement. And so hiding your light under a bushel is a very, very bad idea. And so no matter how afraid you are of standing up for yourself and speaking out, you should be far more afraid of the alternative.
Your book opens up with reference to PTSD, and it really made me think about soldiers coming back, and you mentioned the Mealy Massacre with Lieutenant Callan, who just went on, he and his Marines, if you don't know the Mealy Massacre story, it's a terrifying example of what human beings in their fallenness are able to do under the horrible impulse of mob think, right? Just a killing frenzy. None of them were armed and so on. And you point out that post-traumatic stress disorder is, I don't want to mangle it here, as much or more the realization of what you're capable of. Not necessarily just evil that can befall you passively, but you can actually do.
It's very, very frequently that. It's not always that, because now and then you encounter someone who is, almost always when you're dealing with someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, they have been touched by malevolence. There's no other way of terming it. Sometimes it's another person, especially if the recipient is naive. That's a bad combination. Naive person encounters malevolence. It's like, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. But naive person observes themselves doing something terrible and then cannot live with it, cannot fathom it. That's post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've had a large number of former soldiers come up to me personally and write to me in the last year saying that they're watching my lectures has really helped with their PTSD, because I provide them with a philosophy of good and evil. And if you have PTSD, and because you've been touched by malevolence in one way or another, you need to reorganize your thinking along lines that are fundamentally religious. You need to start seeing the world as a battleground between good and evil, which is what it is in the most real sense.
And that's Solzhenitsyn's insight, right? That the battle lines are drawn in the human heart.
Well, his insight is that battle between good and evil is real, but that the most important battleground is the psychological, right? And that's a direct extension of, I would say, New Testament theology, right? Is that your best bet is to constrain the evil in your own heart. right? Rather than to concern yourself with the transgressions of your neighbor. You have plenty of malevolence to contend with on your own account. You might as well start there.
Yeah, the beam in your own eye.
Yes, exactly that, exactly that. And that's a motif that runs through 12 Rules for Life. Rule 6 is like, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world.
Yeah.
And which I also think it's a very dark chapter, because it's about the Columbine high school shooters and their motivations, their satanic motivations, because that's truly the appropriate level of description. And the autobiography of a man named Karl Panzram, who is one of the most vicious criminals of the 20th century, who wrote very clearly about just exactly why he was out to wreak as much havoc in the world as he possibly could, consciously and with intent. And so, you know, I make a case for that line of reasoning first. It's like, well, being is tragic. Being is touched by malevolence. It's why not develop resentment and hatred for it and do everything to extract revenge against God, because that's really what it is. It's like Cain in the Cain and Abel story. In fact, it's exactly like that. And the answer is something like, well, that's cowardly. That's one answer. And the other answer is, all that does is make everything that you're hypothetically objecting to worse. And so if you're taking a moral stance and saying, well, the horror of the world has made me bitter, resentful, murderous, and genocidal, and isn't it no wonder? It's like, well, you can't logically conclude that you should act in the way that is certain to do nothing but multiply that beyond comprehension. And so there's a call to truth in there and responsibility as an antidote to resentment. You know, when Cain accuses God of favoring Abel in an unfair manner, and you know he has his reasons for doing that, God basically tells him, look to yourself. You're failing because you haven't made the right sacrifices. You're failing because you've dallied with sin consciously and produced something monstrous in consequence. And of course, Cain is absolutely outraged by that, because he was irritated to begin with, because Abel is succeeding and he's failing to fight despite the sacrifices.
Jealousy.
Yes. Well, and then God lays it at his feet, and that's what. And then, you know, the story says Cain's countenance fell, and then he went out and killed Abel. And the question is why? And the answer is, well, because Abel was favored by God. It was revenge against God for the conditions of being. And that's what chapter 6 is about, you know, and it's not, I understand that motivation, but God's response, which is convenient, is correct, given that he's God. It's so nice that his response is correct. It's like, it's like, look to your own devices before you judge being. It's like, yes. It's also an optimistic viewpoint, because maybe you can change yourself. It is possible, and maybe that will work.
And start with setting your own house in perfect, as close to perfect as you can get.
Yeah, stop doing things that you know to be wrong. That's a good start. And it's when I was lecturing last night to the audience, I suggested that they try an experiment just for a month, which is just for a month, try not to say anything that you believe to be untrue. Just as an experiment, just see what happens.
It's only 30 days.
It's only 30 days. You know, and lots of people have written to me and talked to me and said that they've tried exactly that. They've stopped lying by their own definition, right? Not by some externally imposed definition, and that the effects on their life have been unbelievably positive. So, I mean, there's this idea, there's a deep Christian idea, and it's deeper than Christianity even, but it's a deep Christian idea that the being that is brought into being by truthful speech is good. It's like the moral of the first few chapters of Genesis. Right? If you use the logos to bring order into being, and that's truthful speech, then the being that emerges is good. It's like, that's a hypothesis, man. It's like, maybe it's true. Maybe if we told the truth and aimed at the good, then being would transform itself around us into something increasingly less tragic and certainly less malevolent.
It's harder. It's harder to be good. I think there's a line from C.S. Lewis where he's recalling his conversion from atheism to Christianity, and he said, when I was an atheist, I knew God didn't exist, and I was very angry at him for not existing. And then he talks about this idea of trying to be good unless you have a standard against which to measure your progress, you just sort of feel good by default, and it's kind of a narcissistic, self-plumping goodness. But when you have to avoid evil, then you realize I am so weak. There's so few things I can do that are good. So this 30-day don't lie experiment, I'm sure people in the first morning of day one are like, I got so far. So just white lies, gossip, and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's harder. So you're, and this is where I want to go, because the book is not a redo of any of your lectures. From what I've said so far, it's not seen so far. It's not a print version. I couldn't detect any transcript editing there.
No.
But it starts off, as some of your lectures do, awfully bleak.
Oh yeah,
you've got
bleak.
The fact of fallenness and that evil's possible. And then you've got
that evil's certain.
That it is certain. Then there's
tragedy and evil are certainties. Yeah, that's the book, man.
Yeah, and who comes to the rescue? But malevolence on top of that. Hard to find hope unless you present something to get them from the bleakness to the light. And hence soldiers relate to you, and abused people, and people who've been really wounded by life and loss.
Yeah, well, the thing about making the bleak case is, like, let's say that you are fundamentally optimistic and that you fundamentally do have faith and you do believe that truth can prevail. Then you can say, look what it has to prevail over. And then the reality that it has to prevail over is the fact that life is finite and bounded by mortality and tragic and sometimes unfair. And that all of the suffering that's attendant upon that is multiplied almost beyond endurance by malevolence. It's like, everyone knows that, especially people who've been hurt. They know that. And so then you can come out and say, yeah, that is right. You're right in your deepest suspicions. You're correct. But despite that, the power of love, so that would be the desire for things to flourish, and the power of truth is such that it can transcend those bleak realities. And that works perfectly, because no one can dispute the bleak reality. It's like, okay, you can't. You've kind of pushed that to its limit, right? Tragedy and malevolence. It's like, as the fundamental defining preconditions for life. Is there something that can withstand that? The answer seems to be yes. It's like, that's an optimistic message, And I think, well, if you look at the story, the Christian Passion, psychologically, you'd say, well, there's an idea there that voluntary acceptance of suffering produces us a transformation, or a sequence of transformations. That would be the dying and resurrecting God, that's symbolically speaking. And that voluntary acceptance and transformation is sufficiently powerful to transcend tragedy and to keep malevolence at bay. And I think that's true. Now, that's purely psychological. I think there's a metaphysic behind that. And that's where you start to move into religious territory. And I've been doing that. I do that now and then in the book, but mostly it's psychological. Because I also do believe that there's something correct about the idea that spoken truth transforms the potential of being into habitable order. I believe that that's metaphysically true and literally true at the same time, but I don't have the conceptual wherewithal to really understand how that can be true, although I think it is true.
Scapegoating is one of the main themes in the writing of René Girard. Are you familiar with him? He's a French, he just died a couple years ago at the age of 90-something. Mimetic desire in the killing of the king, the slaughter of the scapegoat. And you see this with Cain and Abel, just to return to that for a moment. It's almost like Cain is saying what Adam said. Adam said, the woman you put me here with. Moses would later say, these people, not my people, they're like your people, right? This desire to isolate and to shame the outsider. You've kind of been the object of that. In having so few people at the beginning, like when you were on episode 4, you were the only guy standing up. You're willing to put your head above the trench.
Well, I wasn't the only one. There's a couple of other Canadian academics who've been doing that. Janice Fiamengo is a good example. She's a professor of literature at the University of Ottawa, and she's been taking some pretty decent swings at the postmodern neo-Marxists, especially in women's studies, and been paying the price for it. She's a tough cookie. But
they can't call her white male. What do they call her?
No.
They got to have an
she's
identity
internalized
tag.
her oppression.
Of course, She's a Stockholm syndrome.
That's right. But she's a formidable person, and Gad Saad at Concordia University has been doing a pretty decent job as well. So
he's the Jew-hating Hitler,
Lebanese Jew.
Right. Of course, he's got to be Hitler.
Yes, exactly. Right. So there are a smattering of other people, and more of them are coming out of the woodwork. And I wouldn't say I was even entirely alone to begin with, because I had my family and my friends,
Sure.
and they were like super helpful, well, crucially helpful. That's when I understood the story of Noah's Ark more particularly, you know, because it said Noah, what made Noah stand out was that he was perfect in his generations. And that's actually the ark, is that if your family is in order, you know, then you can withstand a fair bit of buffeting.
And chaos.
My family was in pretty good order. My parents were around when all of this broke, and my wife and my kids. And they were all like, they were there, man. They were watching, they were advising, we were taking things apart and analyzing it, but there wasn't a lot of underground resentment and bitterness and cynicism that was interfering with all that. And thank God, because we just didn't have the luxury of having additional problems. So.
And your father was a teacher, Walter.
Yeah, that's right.
I solicited some questions on Twitter and Facebook. So, hey, guys, send me if you had half an hour with Jordan Peterson, what would it look like? So can I just crank through a couple of them?
Sure.
A surprising number asked me about your father. Ask him about his dad. It seems like you were fathered well. Like you had a mentor who was probably gentle but with a spine.
Oh,
is that where you got
spine
Bucko?
For sure, man.
Is that the origin of Bucko?
Tammy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a Western saying,
sure.
You know, and we did grow up in a Western place, and so it was sort of floating about, and she picked it up as a little epithet that she used to utter when she was irritated, and so I picked it up too, and that's where that came from.
I think young men resonate with that because there's an affection to it, but it also means get your carcass moving, move it, clean your room. You know, kind of there's an insistence to it.
Yeah. Well, my father's a formidable person, and like he's really good with little kids. We had a lot of friction when I was a teenager, and that took some time to sort out. But there were complicated reasons for that. Some of them involved ill health of various sorts, and teenage stupidity, and some intransigence on his part because he's quite a stubborn person. But both my parents. I've been blessed with my parents because they're extraordinarily honest people. I can't think of a time, and this is literally the truth, I can't think of a time when I believe that my parents lied to me about anything. And that's a great gift. And the other thing that my father bequeathed to me, I would say, when I was a child, was an unshakable confidence that I could do what I put my mind to, put my efforts to. And he truly believed that. And there's that's lodged inside me as like an unshakable foundation. And so great. And
no shortcuts attached.
No
shortcuts. One foot up, one foot down. Well, and he's
also extraordinarily demanding. Like it was never, he's like one of those Asian tiger mothers. Like he was always certain that I could do what I set my mind to, but also equally certain that however I was doing it at that moment was nowhere near as good as it could be. And so that was a weird position to be in because he had ultimate faith in me, I would say, but was never satisfied with what I was doing. And so that was kind of rough because I, work hard at something and do well at it. And he'd still say, look, here's where that isn't good enough. Here's where you fell short.
Right. But without making the perfect the enemy of the good.
Right. No, definitely not that. Not that.
All right. So let me just shift to the faith thing because that was a biggie. Because for 8 years, I was the Catholic answer man on radio across the United States. So I'm heavily identified with that faith piece. So this is from Michael Sullivan. By the way, folks, I'm sorry I couldn't get all of them. This morning when I was driving here, more questions were rolling in, but I've distilled a commonality. So here's the question. Dr. Peterson, in light of your affirmation of the archetypal significance of the resurrection, you've expressed some ambivalence about its historical reality. J.R.R. Tolkien had long conversations in Oxford with C.S. Lewis in which Tolkien helped Lewis to understand that the story of Christ was the first archetypal myth that is not just true in a mythopoetic and psychological sense, but also true in the historical sense. That insight, helped by the grace of God, pushed Lewis over and he became a Christian. Where are you in this discernment process on the historical nature of Christ and especially the resurrection?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Like, I do believe that there are places where the mythological and the literal touch. I mentioned one of those earlier, the idea that spoken truth, logos, creates habitable order out of chaos. I think that is literally and metaphorically true. I don't think you can state the nature of being and the role that consciousness plays in it more accurately than that. And so it's metaphysically true, it's religiously true, and it's literally true all at the same time. And so there are times when that happens, and I don't know. See, this is the mystery to me, I would say. I understand what that means. I understand that there are times when the literal and the metaphysical or religious co-occur. And I can understand
so that the literal is the foundation upon which the symbolic or the psychological...
Yeah, it's like the way I've been conceptualizing it is it's as if the material reaches up towards the spiritual and the spiritual reaches down towards the material, and now and then they touch. And that's a miracle when that happens. It's a miracle when that happens. And I do think that happens. With regards to the resurrection, apart from saying what I just said, I would say that I need to think about that for about 3 more years before I would even venture an answer beyond what I've already given. Because there's very much there that I don't understand as well as I need to understand. Part of the reason, I did a biblical series last year, and I got through Genesis. I thought I would get farther than that, but that isn't what happened, and I'm going to do Exodus next, and I'm going to walk through the biblical stories, and I hope I can get through all of them, although I don't know if I'll live long enough to do that. But I want to spend the same amount of energy on the story of the Christian passion as I have with those other lectures to investigate exactly this sort of thing. Because I know there's way more to that story that is available for analysis that I don't understand. Now, I understand what it means symbolically. I understand what the dying and resurrecting God means. It means something like you pick up your cross, you voluntarily accept your suffering, you open yourself humbly to the correction of the world. Parts of you continually die as a consequence. All the parts of you that need to be updated by exposure to truth and wisdom. And it's painful. You have to identify with the part of you that can be reborn continually through those micro deaths. Okay, so that's the archetypal pattern. Well, the Christian claim is there's something going on that transcends that mere archetypal pattern, or that it manifested itself in reality ultimately once. You know, and that was a claim that Carl Jung was actually quite, what would you say, sympathetic to. But I don't know enough about it to say anything more than what I've said psychologically. And so I want to know more about it.
You posted some of the correspondence between Father Victor White and Jung.
And on psychedelics.
On psychedelics. And I've since looked up Father White a little bit more. This is the late English Dominican who died. I think he died within 2 years of Jung. The contemporaries. They had kind of a break, I think, in their relationship. And because I can see Father White's frustration that Jung is he's so suffused with almost. You kind of almost get it, but there's some other piece continually falling out the bottom. I would love to see more of a rapprochement between the Jungians and the more Orthodox Christians, because there's so much, this is one thing I admire about what you do, is that you do not give glib answers. I remember watching you in an interview, and it was an older gentleman. He said, Joel, do you believe in the resurrection? And I was probably a 25-second response, because I could see well, what do you mean by dead? What do you mean by resurrection? Are you trying to claim me for your own? Because I'm sure, he's a Baptist, he's a Mormon, he's whatever.
Because one of the questions, one of the right responses to that is, what do you mean by that question and why are you asking it? Right? Because it's not just a straightforward question by any stretch of the imagination. It's the same thing that happens when people say, well, do you believe in God? It's like, first of all, I don't respond well to that question. It's sort of, it's kind of like asking what you do in the bedroom. It's something like that for me.
Or a bit boxy.
There's that too. There's that. It's manipulative as well, very, very frequently. But I don't like the question, and I don't like to answer questions that I can't feel solid about in my answer. And so I think my fundamental, I have two kind of fundamental answers to that question is the first is, well, what the hell business is it of yours? And it's not up to me to make that public. It's like praying in public, And
well, it might be more intimate than what you do in the bedroom.
Well, it might be, yes. It might be. So it's you just don't get to know that. And you certainly don't get to know it in a one-sentence answer. It's like I could say, well, and then the other answer is, well, I have this course, Maps of Meaning, and I lecture about that question for 40 hours. So the answer to that question is 40 hours long. And I can't condense it into a sentence. It's not condensable. The 40 hours is already a condensing.
Yeah, it's allergic to a bumper sticker.
Yeah, right.
Slogan.
That's right.
Plus, if you say yes, I do, then they go, oh, he's one of us, or yes,
or
I
one
do,
of them,
or one of them. So everyone wants a mascot. They don't want a complicated answer that maybe has some inbuilt ambiguity. When I
well, and with regards to the resurrection too, it's not even obvious what the Gospels mean by the resurrection. Like, it's not like it's a straightforward story. You know, Christ comes back, but people don't really recognize him.
Yeah.
And he's sort of got his old body, but not quite, because he's not recognizable. And then he appears to a lot of people, but then, like, the circumstances of what happens next are far from clear. And so there's this weird mingling in the Gospels themselves of the psychological and the symbolic and the literal. And it's not, I mean, people have argued about what that story means within the Christian camp for 2,000 years. So... And I've been talking to this guy, Jonathan Pajot, who's an Orthodox icon carver.
Phenomenal.
Yeah, he's quite the character.
Yeah, I'm a fervent Catholic for my own reasons, but I think the Orthodox are kicking our ass on art. And his stuff is so immediately arresting, especially his carvings. I'm sure he's a painter as well. So check him out, Jonathan.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and Pajot has talked to me to some degree about the resurrection and about its complexities, and laid out the fact that the story in the Gospels is by no means simple. So to me, it's like it's a murky territory. It's extraordinarily complicated. There's symbolic utility in it. Certainly, the idea of the dead, dying, and resurrecting God. That's an extraordinarily old idea. Jung's idea was, he kind of thought of Christ as someone who fully embodied the archetype. So for Jung, it was really in some sense that the ideal and the actual had converged in Christ. That really was his claim.
The epitome of all the other pointers.
Yeah, that's it. And he said, well, strange things happen when the archetype manifests itself in the flesh. It's like, and that's not really an almost answer either. You know, I mean, that's. And Jung was
what you just said is not ambiguous. It sounds pretty clear.
No, exactly. And I think that is a reasonable summary of Jung's position. But his position is so complex and so nuanced and he was so unbelievably profound. You know, like even his response to psychedelic use. You know, beware of unearned wisdom. Oh man, that's a smart response. And
beware of what?
Unearned wisdom.
Unearned wisdom, yeah.
Right. And
Bonhoeffer would call it cheap grace.
Yes, exactly. Well, and he said, here's the danger in it. It's like, let's say that, this is paraphrasing, but he said, well, let's say you have a psychedelic revelation. It's a true mystical experience. And you see the distance between heaven and hell, and you see your responsibility in relationship to those two entities. What makes you think you can tolerate that in your current condition, tolerate that knowledge? And I think that's an unbelievably wise response. He said, it's just too... See, the other thing that I really liked about Jung was that he was actually quite sympathetic to the merciful element of Catholicism. You know, although he was a Protestant, he knew quite clearly that one of the things that the Catholic Church offered to people was respite from the intolerable weight of knowledge of their own sins. It's like if you're a Protestant...
The expulsion that happens when you tell the truth to someone you believe is the representative of Jesus Christ.
Yes, and who can then forgive you.
They say the the sacramental words, I absolve you.
Right.
More powerful words I've never heard.
Right. And so you can walk out with a clean slate and you can start again. It's like, and the cynic would say, I go sin for a week, go to confession, you're washed clean. Yeah, exactly. And fine, fair enough. There's a place for that cynical judgment. But Jung's point was, look, we all fall short of the glory of God in a serious manner. And if you're a Protestant, it's like, well, you've made a mistake. It's on you. And then you've made another mistake and it's on you. And then you've made another mistake. It's like, how do you get clear of that?
Yeah, and objectively that you hear it. You know, faith, the New Testament continually gives the sense of hearing compliments. Faith comes not by smelling or seeing or touching. Faith comes by hearing. So you hear those words. This is why penitents have the right to go to confession behind a screen, where the identity doesn't matter, but the content of the sins, the regrets in someone, and so on. But where this is leading is when of all that you've written and all the things that I've watched you do, I thought, he's very hard to categorize. I got no box for this guy. But he seems like either a combination of the following: a lapsed Catholic, a crypto-Catholic, or a future Catholic. Not Protestant, because of the split of this. No, not Orthodox for a couple of reasons. Reason number one is that Orthodoxy is frozen in the first 7 centuries. There's no pope to call another ecumenical council. And while their liturgies are beautiful, they have valid sacraments, they're the closest to us of all of Christendom, the Orthodox, by far. They've also caved on some key, I think, fundamental doctrines, like divorce remarriage. 3 strikes you're out, where I don't know how you square that with Jesus' teaching in Matthew 19 about the indissolubility of marriage. So Catholics consider divorce to be superstition. It's like tooth fairy. If you say I will and I do, with no mention of your feelings, and you make that vow, then you're given enough grace to get through, like, come hell or high water. And also contraception. The Orthodox autocephalous churches have pretty much lost the consistency or the universality of their stake, or their take rather, on contraception. But it's so close, you know. I mentioned in my book Sexo Natural, which I'm now rewriting with a better title. Every Christian believed until 1930 that contraception was gravely against God's law, that it was a social disruption. And this is another thing that I noticed about you, that your take on contraception as a game changer in the relationship between men and women. So I'm out on a limb here. I'm taking it you're not Catholic.
No.
How would you finish this sentence? Patrick, right now I'm not Catholic because?
Oh, well, I can give you a comical answer.
Sure.
I have my own church.
You have your own church?
Set up like 6 years ago, something like that. Yeah.
I did that. The Church of Jordan?
No, it's not.
Worship?
It's the Church of Saint Joachim of Florus, actually.
St. Joachim of Florus. Okay.
Yeah, he was a mystic, a medieval mystic who just about got burnt at the stake. He had a doctrine of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And it was a kind of a precursor to psychoanalytic theory, I would say, where he believed there was a Christian epoch of the 1,000 years that was the epoch of the Father, and then there was an epoch of the Son, and then there would be an epoch of the Holy Spirit, which was the dawning modern age. And I kind of liked that idea. I thought it was interesting developmental progression. And so I set up this online church. The reason I did it was because a friend of mine, a former student, had asked me to officiate at his wedding. And so I thought, well, I need a church if I'm going to do that. And so I set up this church, and I thought, it's a church. I'm the only member of this church, by the way. And I'm the metropolitan of the church because I thought that would be very amusing. And it only has one rule at the moment, which is don't follow stupid rules, which I thought was a really funny rule. And so, well, that's my comical.
So the altar is a mirror.
Yeah. So I think that's ridiculously comical. But yeah, you said that you had a hard time figuring out what sort of box to put me in. It's like I have a hard time figuring out what kind of box to put me in too, because I don't know exactly what's going on around me or why. But I need to stay outside of boxes because then I can look at what's inside of them without being part of them. It's something like that. And so, like, I like to recede away from classifications. And you might say, well, that indicates a fundamental lack of commitment. And I suppose that's true to some degree, but true or not, that's the circumstance that I am in at the moment.
Fair enough. In a recent interview, you said that you kind of would like to go to church, or you can see the utility of it with the sense of community and so on.
Oh, yeah. And the sense of shared moral aspiration and all of that. Yeah, definitely. Right. I think it's a real catastrophe that doesn't work for so many people now, including me.
I think you say this in rule number 2 in 12 rules, because I want to keep throwing traffic at your book, because it's only like number 50,000 on Amazon. Culture is an oppressive structure. It's always been that way. Isn't it also a supportive structure?
Oh, definitely. Well, the archetype of culture is the wise king and the devouring father. It's the same. It's both. It's always both. Now, sometimes it's almost all the devouring father. That let's take the situation of Joseph Stalin. And sometimes it's more the wise king. But like every structure of discipline, this is the postmodernists have laid this out quite clearly. For all their pathology, Foucault laid this out quite clearly, is that any supportive structure is also a disciplinary and punitive structure.
Right.
So there's always the lurking face of tyranny and the overt threat of tyranny. It's like, well, yeah, but that's an archetypal reality. You can't just point at your culture and say, oh, it's tyranny, especially not Western culture, because as far as tyrannies go, it's pretty benign.
But SJWs do say everything is tyranny.
Yeah, I know they do. But a lot of that's flight from responsibility. Like they don't like the idea that discipline is necessary, that structure is necessary, that order is necessary, any of that, partly because it would require them to take a level of personal responsibility that they're not willing to take.
Right.
They'd rather do the scapegoating issue and decide that it's, you know, it's the fault of the patriarchy. Everything is the fault of the patriarchy. Well, that's good. You don't have to think again for the rest of your life. You've
Right.
got a one
Yeah.
sentence
Slogan
for, you know, a slogan, battle cry of the dead. That's what slogan means. Yeah.
And discipline means learner. Think of the disciples, right? The disciples of Christ. They're learners,
Right.
And maybe the restricting thing you're talking about can be interpreted as the banks of a river. If a body of water doesn't have banks, it just becomes it's the
Yeah,
flood.
yeah.
But with riverbanks, you can power a city.
Well, it's
because
also
now you
right,
have just
right. Well,
focus.
it's also a precondition for freedom, which is something that Nietzsche pointed out quite brilliantly. He said, "Look, slavery precedes freedom. You have to enslave yourself to something." So, despite the fact that Nietzsche was an absolutely devastating critic of institutional Christianity, he was also an incredibly astute, what would you call, commender of the same institution. You know, he said Catholicism in particular was the vehicle by which the European mind was disciplined. And he thought, well, it got disciplined within the confines of Catholicism under the necessity of explaining everything from a few initial axioms, the rigor that required, then freed the European mind to, well, become scientific, for example.
Right,
and
the
so,
scientific method,
yeah,
and hospitals and universities.
And so Nietzsche knew that the insane, destructive discipline of enforced Catholicism was the vehicle by which the freedom of the European mind had been attained. It's a brilliant critique, but that's what's so wonderful about Nietzsche is like he's not simple-minded. It's
Speaking of bleak,
well,
a clear-eyed vision of the abyss that he seems to have fallen into at the end.
Yes,
hard to determine.
It is. I think the evidence is probably supports the idea that he had some sort of hereditary neurological illness because something similar happened to his father, and I thought for a while that, you know, his own philosophy was what drove him into the asylum. But I read his writings in chronological order, and I don't believe that. I don't believe that as a clinician.
Well, the only musical they could make of his life would be a comedy. It's just, can't imagine. Or maybe remember the producers? Springtime for Hitler. Well, there's more evidence about my take on this crypto-Catholic thing, because you believe that truth, no matter where it is, no matter what source it comes from, is to be found and dusted off and shone, even from unexpected places. Like I know a lot of pious brethren who Nietzsche didn't he belong to the devil? Wasn't Jung like a heretic Gnostic? Well, go deeper and really listen and spend some time reading. You might find truth to be extracted. So it's both.
Well, the thing is that
or.
Nietzsche might be been of Satan's party, and Jung might have been a heretical Gnostic. But what the hell makes you so sure you're not? That's the thing. It's like, okay, you've got the right take on the people who are doing the criticizing. You're so sure that you're in Christ's party, are you? Just because you say you are? It's like, good luck with that. Good luck with that. And, Nietzsche, as a critic of Christianity, I think did Christianity a great favor, because for someone to come along and say, well, this is rotten and your foundation isn't working here, and this is where you've gone wrong. Like, you did this okay. And to really do that, I mean, Nietzsche really did that. And it wasn't because he was an enemy of Christianity, precisely. I mean, Nietzsche's a very tricky thinker, because he would announce himself as an enemy of Christianity. But a lot of that, I mean, he has a book called The Antichrist, right? I mean,
subtle.
Right, well, exactly. But, Nietzsche's always ironic. There's always an element of irony. And it's a challenge to the reader. It's like, well, this book is the Antichrist. It's like, well, who's on whose side here? Is it the harsh critic of dogmatic Christianity? Or is the spirit of the harsh critic the true Christianity? Well, because it's part of the seeking for truth.
Right. And if it's true, then it can stand severe tire kicking, because its founder was tortured and murdered. The whole thing's founded on failure, or apparent failure. Not the victorious king.
Yeah, well, that's
kicked the Roman butt back into the
that's the other thing too with Nietzsche, is you're never sure. When he speaks directly of Christ, it's almost always in glowing terms. When he speaks of Christianity, his fundamental critique is that the Christianity that manifested itself was a poor imitation of what should have been erected on that vision. And you can argue about whether or not that's true. And Dostoevsky, I think, is a more merciful critic of Christianity than Nietzsche, because especially in the Grand Inquisitor, which is an absolutely brilliant little set piece, where he has the Inquisitor decide once again to crucify Christ, because he's come back to disrupt all of the dogmatic work that has been done, but in the final analysis leaves the door open.
Yeah, leaves the door ajar.
And that's sort of, I think that's Dostoevsky's judgment about Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism. He said, despite their failures as institutions, their tyranny, even the tyranny that would make them into the Pharisees that persecuted the prophets, which is what Christ accused the Pharisees of, which is very, very funny.
Yeah.
They left the door open, and that's what makes Dostoevsky such a transcendent genius. It's like he could do that. It's such a brilliant move. You know,
there's a story in Boccaccio's Decameron, and this is the heir of the Borgia popes, really corrupt guys in Rome. And the story is about a Jewish businessman named Abraham in Paris, and he goes to the Archbishop of Paris investigating baptism. And he says, "Oh, Abraham, wonderful. Do you want to? Let's do it now." He says, "No, not so fast, Your Excellency. I want to go to Rome first and get close to the rudders of the bark of Peter. I want to see up close how it all operates." Now, he doesn't want him to go to Rome because he's going to see open corruption, and it's going to be a mess, and there's no way he'll be baptized. He goes, "No, I'll be back in a fortnight. I'll see you in 2 weeks." Okay. So he goes to Rome and he comes back. The door opens and there's Abraham grinning broadly, and the Archbishop says, "Abraham, you're back from Rome. How was it?" He said, "Oh, I was disgusted. I mean, the Pope's having murders, hit jobs. No one believes it. It's obviously corrupt and really foul. I was very distressed by what I saw in Rome. But can we go forward with baptism?" And he said, "Well, Abraham, why do you still want to be baptized?" And he said, "I told you, I'm a practical Jewish businessman. Any operation that corrupt would have folded 40 minutes after the resurrection. It's been here 1,500 years. It has to have God behind it. I want in." I want in.
Yeah.
I love that story.
Yeah.
We got a few minutes
so
left.
You asked me what box I should be in, and I just had a little image about that.
Well, I don't want you in a box. I'm just trying to get my arms around your worldview.
So those kids' toys where there's a little box and you crank it, and then the jack.
Jack in the box.
That's it. So is the jack in the box or out of the box? It's like that's the position that I'm in. It's like I'm the jack in the box.
Have you read Marshall McLuhan much?
I wouldn't say much, but enough.
Yeah, I'm sort of an amateur student of his thought, and I'm going to put links to some interviews on my website in the show notes here. He was interviewed by a guy who's now very close to being named a saint, Father Patrick Peyton. And Father Peyton's this very simple, childlike Irish priest, and there's Marshall McLuhan at the height of his intellectual powers. And the way he gets it across reminds me of you, bringing lofty, tough truths into a kind of a palatable form. But I wanted to just put your name on that nomen est omen couch. Nomen est omen, names are destiny. Sometimes the Romans believed that it so often is the case that someone's name contains a clue to their fate or to their role in the world. So in San Diego, California, the sheriff who reports on grisly crime scenes is named Sheriff Gore. There's a
I knew a neurologist, Frankenstein.
Exactly. Yeah, I went to see here, full disclosure, there's a urologist in San Diego, Dr. James Fawcett. In Halifax, there's a facial surgery guy, Dr. Pretty. It's like you can't make this up.
Yeah.
So Jordan is the river. It's the summit, or if you will, the penultimate stage before you get to the promised land. And Joshua led his people to the Jordan. Right. So the Jordan, there are waters there, it's refreshment, and it's the beginning of heaven. So that was my little angle in Jordan. Now Bernd. Bernd, so Bernd, not Bucko, just for people who don't know. Bernd reminds me of burnt. That you've been burnt. You've been I can tell you've suffered. You write movingly of Michaela's bone illness. My wife and I lost a baby girl at age 15 days in 2006. I know what it's like to be hardwired to protect your daughter and can do nothing about it. So there's that water, and the water sort of engulfs the burnt part. You've also been burnt by the media in a way, by being shamed and shellacked and so on. And of course, Peterson, well, it's the son of Peter, hence my crypto-Catholic intuition.
Well, Barent is a derivation.
What is Barent from? Oh, bear, like
Scandinavian.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for whatever that's worth.
At least 25 cents Canadian,
At least,
or whatever
at
that
least,
is in Bitcoin.
or 20 cents American.
I have a friend who's a comedian, Tom Wilson. Tom played Biff in the Back to the Future movies.
Oh yeah.
And he'll say, "How you guys doing? I feel like yen." What's that even
Oh
mean?
yeah, that's a good day. A
What's that
million
even
yen.
mean?
Or a million Venezuelan reals. Isn't that what the Venezuelan currency is? I think it's the real.
I
might
think
be
it's
wrong
negative
about
Bitcoin at this
Oh,
point,
man.
like barter. Yeah,
Yeah.
God bless the Venezuelans.
Yeah. Do you know, here's a nice story
Yeah.
about Venezuela. So there are children starving to death in Venezuela. So do you know how the government's dealing with that? It's made it illegal to list starvation as the cause of a child's death in a Venezuelan hospital.
Of course.
Of course.
That's Stalin's Soviet
You
Union.
bet, man.
You
You
cannot
bet.
talk about the problem.
Yeah,
Back to
that's-
the secondary thing, right?
If you need a diagnosis of what's going on in Venezuela in one sentence, that's it.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. Yeah.
With that, I'm going to segue as I say thank you for your time. I know you're just in an unbelievable productivity tight timeline. This is He Leadeth Me by Father
Thank you.
Walter Chizek. Father Chizek is another candidate for sainthood. America has 3 American-born female saints. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, the daughter of a billionaire named Mother Catherine Drexel, and the Native American Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. We have no men. He's one of them. This is the book he says that he wanted to write, not the book his publisher wanted him to write. Now that book is also very good. It's called With God in Russia. But I think you'll find just a ton of things in light of your study of totalitarianism,
Okay.
because he
Great.
lived it, and he just distills. He reminds me of a Jesuit version of Viktor Frankl.
Okay.
All right. Godspeed.
Thanks a lot,
It's
man.
been an honor. I really appreciate
Thanks
your
a lot.
time.
It's good to talk to you again. And thank you very much for interviewing me in the early stages of all of this. Like, there was a number of people in the media, you were one of them, who started to provide some groundswell of support for what I was doing, and it was really helpful. It was
Well,
really
you
helpful.
simply blew up without me, that's for sure. And keep on swinging. A lot of people praying for you. We got your back.
That's great.
All right, very
It's
good,
good to
Jordan.
have
All
people
right.
have your back.